Welcome to Difficult Conversations, how to discuss what matters most. Every day we face moments that demand courage, asking for a raise, addressing poor performance, confronting disrespectful behavior, or apologizing for a mistake. Whether at work, at home, or across the neighborhood fence, these interactions often leave us feeling vulnerable, anxious, and stuck. We fear that speaking up will make things worse, yet we know that staying silent allows the underlying issues to fester. The purpose of this journey is to pull you out of that paralyzing cycle. It is not about teaching you how to deliver a hand grenade message with a sugar coating, because no matter how softly it is thrown, a grenade still causes damage. Instead, this narrative is designed to fundamentally shift how you approach conflict. By dissecting the hidden structure of our most challenging interactions, we will transform the destructive battle of warring messages into a constructive, learning conversation. You will learn to navigate the three distinct layers present in every difficult dialogue: the story of what happened, the tangled web of feelings, and the deeply personal threat to your identity. Ultimately, this is a blueprint for speaking your truth with clarity and power, listening with genuine curiosity, and facing life's toughest interpersonal challenges with integrity and reduced anxiety. Chapter 1. Sort out the three conversations. Consider a scenario where an individual, let's call him Jack, finds himself in a tense exchange with a friend and client, Michael. Michael urgently needs a financial brochure designed overnight. Jack sacrifices his personal time, working into the early hours to deliver the project on schedule. However, instead of gratitude, Jack is met with a harsh voicemail from Michael criticizing a minor error in a chart and demanding an immediate fix. When they finally speak, the dialogue quickly degenerates. Jack tries to defend his hard work and the insignificance of the mistake, while Michael insists on professionalism and demands a simple yes or no regarding whether Jack will redo it. Jack reluctantly agrees, but the resentment lingers long after the call ends, leaving their friendship strained and Jack wondering how things went so wrong. When we dissect an exchange like this, we begin decoding the hidden architecture of these fraught interactions. It turns out that regardless of the endless variety of disputes we face, whether with a spouse, a coworker, or a neighbor, every deeply frustrating dialogue shares a common underlying framework. In the heat of the moment, blinded by our anxiety and the specifics of the argument, this framework remains invisible. Yet identifying this hidden structure is the single most vital step toward transforming how we handle our most demanding interpersonal challenges. There is always a vast, unspoken dialogue echoing just beneath the spoken words. If we examine what Jack and Michael were actually thinking but refuse to say, a whole new landscape emerges. Jack is privately seething about his cancelled plans and Michael's lack of gratitude, feeling that his friend is overreacting to a microscopic flaw. He feels reduced to a mere proofreader and struggles with the urge to defend himself without destroying the client relationship. Conversely, Michael is harboring his own silent doubts, questioning his initial decision to hire Jack after previous disappointments and wondering if extending a professional lifeline to a friend was a foolish risk. This profound gap between the internal monologue and the external dialogue is the breeding ground for conversational dysfunction. We are so distracted by the noise inside our own heads, uncertain of what is safe to reveal and what must remain concealed, that authentic communication becomes impossible. Through the analysis of countless human interactions, a pattern reveals itself. Every difficult exchange is, in reality, three distinct conversations unfolding simultaneously. Whatever the subject matter, our swirling thoughts and turbulent emotions consistently fall into three predictable categories. In each of these realms, we are prone to making specific, systematic errors that distort our perception and escalate the conflict. The first of these realms is the debate over the facts, the struggle to define reality. People constantly clash over what happened, what was said, who meant what, and who is ultimately at fault. Jack and Michael wrestle over whether the chart was truly unacceptable and whose responsibility it was to catch the error. The second realm is driven by emotion. Every tense encounter poses silent questions regarding our internal state. Are the feelings I am experiencing justified? Should I suppress my anger or let it show? What am I to do with the other person's disappointment or hostility? Jack's internal monologue is heavy with a sense of betrayal and anger, while Michael is quietly radiating anxiety over his own professional pressures. Though they never explicitly discuss these emotions, the feelings bleed into their words anyway, poisoning the interaction. The third realm is the deeply private internal reckoning with what the situation implies about us. This is the quiet negotiation we conduct with ourselves regarding our own competence, goodness, and worthiness. We ask ourselves if the conflict means we are flawed, unlovable, or inept, and this internal verdict directly dictates our level of anxiety. Jack is fighting off the implication that he is a careless amateur, while Michael is battling the fear that he is a poor judge of character. Managing these three simultaneous layers might seem like a daunting task, but it is far less destructive than blindly stumbling through the collateral damage of unexamined conflict. There are certain realities we must simply accept. We cannot eradicate the complexity of differing perspectives, nor can we magically bestow our own hidden knowledge upon another person. We will always face emotionally volatile situations that threaten our sense of self. However, what we have the power to change is how we respond. Typically, we presume we already possess all the necessary facts. We bury or unleash our emotions, and we ignore the existential threats to our identity. By recognizing these habitual missteps, we can begin to forge a more constructive path. In the struggle over reality, we spend a massive amount of energy arguing over who is right, what the other person intended, and who deserves the blame. On all three fronts, we are paralyzed by flawed assumptions. The first paralyzing assumption is the absolute certainty of our own rightness. We enter the fray convinced that our view is the objective truth and the other person is simply wrong. This rigid belief is a profound source of misery. The reality is that these disputes are rarely about objective facts. They are about conflicting interpretations, differing values, and divergent perceptions. Jack and Michael do not disagree that the chart has an error. They disagree on whether the error matters and how it should be handled. When we abandon the crusade to prove our infallibility, we free ourselves to explore how the other person makes sense of the world, shifting our posture from dictating the truth to investigating perspectives. The second hazard involves our assumptions about motives. We invent the other person's intentions based solely on how their actions affected us. If we feel slighted, we assume they intended to slight us. Worse, when their motives are ambiguous, we instinctively assume the worst. Yet, intentions are invisible. They exist only in the mind of the actor. Human motivation is a tangled web, often mixed, sometimes accidental, and frequently disconnected from us entirely. Leaping to uncharitable conclusions about why someone acted the way they did is a recipe for mutual defensiveness and lasting damage. The third error is our obsession with fault. When things unravel, our immediate instinct is to play a game of blame roulette, desperate to ensure the pointer lands on anyone but ourselves. We pour our energy into self-defense and punishment. Yet, blame is a dead end. It incites denial and fear, blinding us to the interactive nature of the problem. In almost every conflict, the outcome is the result of a joint contribution. Focusing on understanding how each person's actions interacted to create the mess allows us to dismantle the dysfunctional system and prevent its recurrence, rather than simply punishing the easiest target. Beyond the debate over facts lies the turbulent realm of emotion. We often try to sanitize our interactions, believing that bringing feelings into the workplace or a serious discussion is messy and inappropriate. We fear that revealing our vulnerability will invite further injury or that we will be overwhelmed by the other person's raw pain. Consequently, we attempt to stick purely to business. Yet treating a difficult exchange as a purely rational problem is like watching a dramatic performance with the sound muted. You see the actions but entirely miss the meaning. These interactions are not merely accompanied by emotions. They are fundamentally about them. Unspoken resentment and unacknowledged hurt do not dissipate simply because we refuse to verbalize them. While navigating this emotional minefield is never without risk, learning to articulate and process these feelings is essential. Avoiding them does not create safety. It merely guarantees that the underlying wounds will fester and eventually destroy the connection. Perhaps the most elusive and challenging layer of all is the quiet crisis of the self. Before, during, and after any tense encounter, we are constantly evaluating what the event says about our place in the world. It may seem absurd to link a mundane disagreement over a neighborhood dog to one's core identity, but whenever an interaction feels fraught, it is because something fundamental about our self-image is on the line. Are we a good neighbor? Are we a competent employee? Are we someone who helps or hinders? When this internal narrative is threatened, we lose our equilibrium. Our confidence evaporates. Panic sets in, and we may find ourselves stammering or desperately conceding points just to escape the psychic discomfort. Acknowledging that this internal identity crisis is a natural component of conflict is the first step toward managing it. We can learn to ground ourselves, transforming this profound vulnerability into a source of resilience. Recognizing these intricate layers fundamentally alters our purpose in the interaction. We typically enter a dispute to deliver a definitive message, to prove our point, to demand compliance, or to administer a verbal lashing. But once we grasp the complexities of perception, the ambiguity of intent, the reality of joint contribution, the centrality of emotion, and the fragility of identity, the desire to simply deliver a message loses its appeal. We realize that we do not merely have a message to broadcast, we have an urgent need to learn. We shift from a stance of persuasion to one of mutual discovery. We invite the other person to help us untangle the narrative, to share their unseen reality, and to collaboratively map the path forward. This transformation from a battle of competing monologues into a genuine journey of shared understanding is the essence of navigating human conflict with integrity and grace. Chapter 2. Stop arguing about who's right. Explore each other's stories. When faced with a fundamental disagreement, the most natural human instinct is to argue. We engage in conflicts over everything from financial investments and business strategies to neighborhood disputes and household chores. Often, these differences of opinion are inconsequential, easily brushed aside. Yet, there are moments when a disagreement feels profound, lodging itself at the center of a failing relationship. When others refuse to see the logic in our requests or the wisdom in our perspectives, frustration sets in. We feel misunderstood, dismissed, or actively harmed. As the divide deepens, we resort to arguing, convinced that asserting our position with enough force will eventually break through their resistance. But arguing rarely bridges the gap. In our private thoughts, the source of the conflict seems glaringly obvious. The other person is the problem. Depending on the situation, we might characterize them as selfish, hopelessly naive, irrationally controlling, or simply unreasonable. Consider a scenario where a daughter dreams of moving to a difficult city to pursue acting. To her parents, she is dangerously naive. Or envision an older relative who insists on sleeping on a battered, unsupportive mattress despite severe back pain. To the family trying to buy a replacement, the relative's stubbornness defies all reason. Armed with the certainty that we are right and they are fundamentally flawed in their thinking, we push harder. We attempt to educate the naive, expose the selfish, and inject logic into the irrational. We trade conclusions, insisting that a new mattress is necessary or that couples therapy is essential, only to have our conclusions dismissed just as swiftly. This persistence creates a circular battle. Neither party feels heard, powerlessness takes root, and the relationship sustains lasting damage. If we pause to examine the other side, a surprising reality emerges. The older relative, for instance, might view the ancient mattress as a sanctuary of familiarity in a rapidly changing world, a tangible connection to a spouse who has passed away. From her vantage point, the family's relentless pressure to replace it feels deeply insensitive and controlling. The paradox of conflict is that we never cast ourselves as the villain or the fool. Our own actions and demands make perfect sense within the narrative we have constructed about the situation. The critical realization is that the other person's actions make equally perfect sense within their narrative. We are essentially living in entirely different stories, completely unaware of the collision. It is as though two characters from entirely different fictional universes are trying to negotiate a plot line. When we argue, we trade the final conclusions of our respective stories without ever descending to the foundation where those stories were built. Arguing also fails as a tool for persuasion because human beings are psychologically incapable of meaningful change unless they first feel genuinely understood. Demanding compliance or dictating behavioral shifts only hardens resistance. In a professional setting, a manager might endlessly reprimand an employee for missing deadlines, oblivious to the fact that the employee feels entirely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of needy clients and unsupported by the administration, until the manager shifts the goal from demanding punctuality to investigating the employee's experience. the systemic issue remains unresolved. Only when both parties articulate the invisible pressures they face can true collaboration begin. To escape the futility of arguing, we must examine why our narratives diverge so sharply in the first place. These distinct worldviews do not materialize out of thin air. They are the result of a systematic, though largely unconscious, psychological process. We begin by taking in information from the vast, chaotic reality around us. We then interpret that data, assigning it meaning, and finally, we draw conclusions. Divergence can occur at every step of this journey. First, we simply do not possess the same information. The sheer volume of sensory input and situational data in any given moment is too massive for the human brain to process in its entirety. Consequently, we selectively notice certain details while entirely ignoring others, and our selections are heavily biased by our individual identities and priorities. An artist and a financial analyst walking through the same building will observe entirely different realities. One person might be acutely attuned to the emotional undercurrents of a meeting, while another is fixated solely on the structural logic of the proposal being presented. A white employee might perceive a workplace as a triumph of diversity based on recent promotions, while a minority colleague might experience the same environment through the lens of subtle, daily exclusions and historical biases. They are operating in the same physical space but processing wildly different datasets. Furthermore, we each possess an exclusive monopoly on our internal landscapes. We know our own anxieties, our hidden constraints, and the pureness of our unspoken intentions. We have no access to the internal life of the other person, yet we routinely act as if we possess a complete understanding of their motivations. Even when two people are presented with the exact same set of facts, they frequently assign entirely different meanings to them. This divergence in interpretation is heavily influenced by our past experiences. Our personal histories act as a filter through which the present is understood. An individual who grew up during times of profound economic scarcity might view a moderately priced celebratory dinner not as a joyful reward, but as a stressful and irresponsible extravagance. Every deeply held conviction we possess, from parenting philosophies to financial habits, is a direct descendant of the experiences we observed and internalized throughout our lives. From these experiences, we forge implicit rules about how the world ought to operate. We carry an unconscious rulebook dictating what is professional, what is polite, and what is acceptable. Conflict erupts when our rulebook clashes with someone else's. One partner might believe that true professionalism means arriving strictly on time, while the other believes that true professionalism means focusing on a critical task until it is perfect, even if it means arriving 10 minutes late. Because these rules remain unspoken, each person views the other's behavior as an objective violation of basic decency. Furthermore, our conclusions are almost inevitably colored by self-interest. The human mind possesses a remarkable, self-serving elasticity. When we assess a situation, we instinctively highlight the data that supports our preferred outcome and conveniently dismiss or explain away evidence to the contrary. Studies in negotiation demonstrate that buyers and sellers evaluating the exact same company will reach vastly different self-serving valuations without ever realizing their objectivity has been compromised. This profound psychological bias demands a level of humility regarding the absolute certainty of our own rightness. The antidote to this paralyzing certainty is curiosity. Instead of marveling at the sheer irrationality of the opposition, we must ask ourselves what unseen information they possess. Curiosity invites us into their narrative. A husband who chooses to watch a football game rather than accompany his wife to visit a newborn relative might appear incredibly selfish on the surface. Yet, if we enter his story, we might find a man pushed to the absolute brink of mental exhaustion by the demands of his career, for whom a few hours of solitary distraction is a desperate measure of self-preservation. Assuming we already know the whole story is the greatest barrier to resolving the tension. Equally important is the task of turning that curiosity inward. We are often blind to the mechanics of our own story-making process. We do not fully recognize the implicit rules we are enforcing or the fragmented data we are relying upon. We must interrogate our own certainties. Embracing this complexity requires us to adopt a psychological posture that accommodates multiple realities simultaneously. We are conditioned to believe that if the other person's story is valid, our own must be false. This is a false dichotomy. We do not have to choose between their experience and ours. We can hold both. This dual acceptance acknowledges that the world is intricate and that conflicting emotional truths can coexist. We can feel deeply wronged and angry, and the other person can feel equally wronged and angry. Acknowledging the validity of their internal experience does not require us to abandon the strength of our own convictions. It merely shifts the objective from determining a solitary victor to collaboratively managing the problem based on a shared understanding of both realities. There is a temptation to claim exceptions to this rule. What about situations where we possess undeniable objective truth? Consider a parent confronting a child about the dangers of smoking. The medical facts are not up for debate, yet the difficult conversation is rarely about the objective truth of the health risks. It is about the complex emotional web of fear, independence, control, and rebellion that surrounds the issue. Proclaiming absolute rightness, even when backed by science, does not dismantle the emotional architecture of the conflict. Similarly, when delivering definitive bad news, such as terminating an employee or ending a relationship, understanding the other person's story might seem irrelevant since the outcome is non-negotiable. However, acknowledging their narrative does not dilute the finality of the decision. It allows you to deliver the news with clarity and compassion, validating their emotional response while remaining firm in your own boundaries. The journey through any profound conflict must begin with a suspension of judgment. Before we can plot a course forward, we must painstakingly map the psychological terrain we are currently standing on, recognizing that our map and the other person's map are fundamentally different documents. Chapter 3. Don't assume they meant it. Disentangle intent from impact. Imagine a couple, Laurie and Leo, attending a party with friends. As Laurie reaches for a second serving of ice cream, Leo publicly suggests she lay off the dessert. Laurie, who battles insecurities about her weight, shoots him a withering look. The rest of the evening is steeped in icy silence. When the inevitable confrontation erupts later, it is a textbook clash. Laurie accuses Leo of trying to humiliate and control her. Leo, defensively bewildered, insists he was merely trying to help her stick to her diet. He flips the script, accusing her of being overly sensitive and perhaps even starting fights on purpose. They end the night exhausted, alienated, and trapped in a recurring cycle of mutual resentment. This agonizing loop is fueled by a battle over intentions. In almost every conflict, the question of what the other person meant to do sits at the very center of our distress. We judge people harshly if we believe they meant to wound us, whereas we readily forgive an inconvenience if we believe it was accidental. A vehicle blocking our driveway provokes a very different reaction if it is a careless luxury car versus a wailing ambulance. Yet despite the immense weight we place on intentions, we routinely make two catastrophic errors when navigating them. The first critical mistake is the profound, blinding assumption that we actually know what another person intended. We do not. Intentions are entirely invisible. They exist exclusively within the private universe of another person's mind. Because we cannot observe them directly, we are forced to deduce them. And the primary mechanism we use to deduce someone else's intentions is the impact their behavior has on us. If we feel hurt, we automatically conclude they intended to hurt us. If we feel slighted, we are certain they meant to belittle us. We make this leap so reflexively that we fail to recognize it as a guess. We treat our assumption as an absolute, unassailable fact. Tragically, when we derive intentions from impact, we almost universally assume the worst. We rarely grant others the benefit of the doubt when we are nursing a wound. If a colleague is curt in a meeting, we do not pause to wonder if they are overwhelmed by a family crisis. We immediately conclude they are attempting to undermine us professionally. This is a profound double standard because we treat our own actions with immense charity. When we ourselves snap at a coworker, we excuse it as the inevitable byproduct of stress and fatigue, fully aware that we harbored no malice. We know our own invisible constraints, yet we deny others that same grace, allowing our pain to dictate a narrative of their malice. This habit of assuming the worst extracts a terrible toll on our relationships. We swiftly graduate from believing someone had a bad intention to believing they are fundamentally a bad person. This judgment hardens our perception, coloring every subsequent interaction. We begin treating them as an adversary, and our defensive, accusatory posture predictably triggers a hostile response. When we ask an accusatory question demanding to know why they wanted to hurt us, the other person feels falsely charged. They immediately mount a defense, the conversation devolves into a defensive shouting match, and our assumption of their hostility becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The second great mistake belongs to the person accused. It is the misguided belief that demonstrating good intentions magically erases the pain caused by the impact. When Leo explains to Laurie that he only wanted to help her diet, he expects her hurt to evaporate. When it does not, he becomes frustrated. He fails to realize that when someone accuses us of bad intentions, they are actually broadcasting two distinct messages. The first is an assumption about our motives, but the second, and far more vital, is a declaration of their pain. By rushing to defend our pure motives, we completely ignore the other person's suffering. We fail to hear that they are bleeding. To the person who is hurt, the distinction between "I wanted to cause you pain" and "I was merely careless and did not prioritize your feelings" is practically irrelevant. Both realities leave a wound. Furthermore, human motivation is rarely as pristine as we like to claim. Our intentions are frequently a tangled, contradictory mixture of genuine care, unconscious selfishness, and unresolved frustration. When we stubbornly insist that our motives were entirely angelic, we send a chilling message that we are more interested in protecting our ego than in understanding the complexities of our relationship or acknowledging the other person's pain. This dynamic frequently plagues conflicts not just between individuals but across entire groups, where the defense of good intentions is often used to dismiss the legitimate grievances and painful impacts experienced by others. Escaping this destructive cycle requires us to fundamentally shift our approach. To overcome the first mistake, we must actively and consciously disentangle impact from intent. This requires mental discipline. You must break the situation down into three distinct components: what the person actually said or did, what the emotional impact of that action was on you, and what assumption you subsequently made about their underlying motives. Once you isolate that assumption, you must strip it of its certainty. You must recognize it for what it is: a mere hypothesis. It is a guess built on the flimsy foundation of your own emotional reaction. When you bring the issue to the other person, do not lead with an indictment. Instead, share the measurable impact their actions had on you, and then present your assumption about their intentions purely as a hypothesis to be tested. You might say that you felt humiliated by their comment and that it left you wondering if they intended to embarrass you, inviting them to clarify their reality. It is crucial to remain authentic. Do not pretend you harbor no suspicions, but offer those suspicions with humility rather than righteous certainty. Even with this careful approach, anticipate defensiveness. Human beings are fragile, and untangling motivations is delicate work. Your goal is to alleviate their need to defend their character so they can safely examine their behavior. To avoid the second mistake, the trap of the accused, you must learn to listen past the accusation. When someone lashes out at your motives, you must resist the overwhelming urge to immediately launch into a defense of your character. Instead, listen for the unspoken pain beneath their anger. Acknowledge that they are hurting. Validate their emotional reality first. Only after they feel heard and understood should you attempt to gently clarify what you were trying to achieve. And when you do, be brave enough to reflect on the true complexity of your own motivations. Admit that your actions, even if well-meaning, might have carried a shadow of frustration or thoughtlessness. By embracing this complexity, we dismantle the battle lines of intention and open the door to genuine reconciliation. Chapter 4. Abandon Blame. Map the contribution system. When things go wrong in our lives, our immediate instinct is to identify who is at fault. Whether it is a project that failed at work, a vacation that devolved into a fight, or a marriage that ended in divorce, we feel a visceral need to point the finger. We do this for a number of reasons. It makes us feel safer to believe we have control over outcomes. It provides an outlet for our anger, and it allows us to mete out justice. If the problem is someone else's fault, then they must be the one to change. They must be the one to apologize, and they must be the one to pay the price. However, the pursuit of blame is one of the most destructive forces in communication. When we focus on blame, we inevitably create a defensive reaction. No one wants to be the target of an accusation, so the moment someone feels blamed, they shift their energy away from solving the problem and towards self-protection. They stop listening, they stop reflecting, and they start looking for ways to counterattack or deflect. Blame also ignores the reality of how problems actually form. In almost every difficult situation, the outcome is not the result of one person's singular action, but the consequence of a contribution system, an interactive web of choices, behaviors, and reactions from everyone involved. By shifting from blame to contribution, we do not mean that everyone is equally responsible, nor do we suggest that you should not hold others accountable for their actions. Rather, we suggest that looking for blame asks, who is to blame for this? Whereas looking for contribution asks, how did we all contribute to this outcome? This shift is vital because while we have very little control over the other person's behavior, we have total control over our own. By identifying our contribution, we gain the agency to change our own part of the system, which is the only reliable way to shift the dynamics of the entire interaction. There are several common ways we contribute to the problems we face, often without realizing it. The first is avoidance. By choosing not to address a problem early, we allow it to grow until it becomes a crisis. If you stay silent while a colleague keeps interrupting you, you are contributing to the fact that they continue to do so. They may not even realize it bothers you because you have never said anything. The second is being unhelpful, where we respond to the other person's behavior in a way that fuels the conflict rather than de-escalating it. If someone is being difficult and we respond with sarcasm or withdrawal, we are adding fuel to the fire. Another frequent form of contribution is assuming the other person's intent. When we decide someone is acting out of malice, we treat them as an enemy, and they, in turn, feel judged and treated poorly, leading them to act in ways that confirm our worst suspicions. Finally, we contribute by the way we influence the other person's choices. We often set up the conditions, whether through tone, timing, or our own emotional state, that make it difficult for the other person to respond in a constructive way. Mapping the contribution system requires a high degree of honesty. It requires us to look back at the conversation and ask, what did I do or fail to do that kept this conflict alive? Did I withhold my concerns? Did I approach the conversation at the wrong time? Did I use language that was guaranteed to make them feel attacked? Crucially, when you invite the other person to look at the contribution system with you, you must be careful not to hide behind the word contribution as a thinly veiled way to say, I'll admit to a small mistake if you admit you were mostly at fault. That is not contribution. That is a negotiation for who gets the smaller share of the blame. A genuine exploration of contribution involves a willingness to see your own role clearly, even when it is uncomfortable. When you can step back and objectively map the system, identifying how your actions and the other person's actions have interlocked to create this current result, the need to blame dissolves. The focus shifts from punishing the past to designing a different future. You no longer need to figure out who is wrong, you only need to figure out how to interact differently next time. By changing the pieces of the system you control, you force the entire structure to shift, opening the possibility for a completely different kind of conversation. Chapter 5. Have your feelings, or they will have you. Conflict is inextricably linked to emotion. We often operate under the mistaken belief that difficult conversations should be professional, rational, and free from the messy interference of feelings. We are conditioned to think that expressing vulnerability, anger, or hurt is a sign of weakness or a failure to maintain control. Yet this suppression is the single greatest cause of conversational failure. Feelings do not simply vanish because we ignore them. They are the bedrock of the interaction. When we attempt to sanitize our speech, we are essentially trying to have a conversation with the sound turned off. The words may be clear, but the meaning and the power is entirely absent. If we do not acknowledge our feelings, they manifest in destructive ways. They leak into our tone of voice, our body language, and the sharp, unintended barbs we insert into our arguments. If we spend the entire time suppressing our frustration, it will inevitably erupt in a way that is far more damaging than if we had addressed it directly at the start. Worse, if we refuse to confront our emotions, they will confront us. They will drive our behavior from the shadows, making us rigid, defensive, or strangely detached from the person we are speaking with. The challenge is that many of us are uncomfortable with the full spectrum of our emotional lives. We have learned to categorize some feelings as good or safe, and others as bad or dangerous. We might feel comfortable expressing happiness or excitement, but feel entirely incapable of voicing deep hurt or raw anger. In the context of a difficult conversation, this leads to feeling filtering. We take the complex, turbulent reality of our emotional state and edit it down into something that feels socially acceptable or less risky. However, in doing so, we strip the conversation of the very information that could lead to resolution. When you express only a fraction of your emotional truth, the other person receives a fragmented message that lacks the necessary context to truly understand your position. Having your feelings does not mean you should act them out. There is a profound difference between being under the influence of your feelings and talking about your feelings. When you are under their influence, you scream, you lash out, you blame, or you withdraw in silence. You become a passenger to your own emotional state. When you talk about your feelings, you take ownership of them. You articulate what you are experiencing with clarity, curiosity, and responsibility. The first step in this process is to get beneath the surface. Often, what we present to the outside world is a judgment or a characterization rather than a feeling. We say, "I feel like you are being selfish," or "I feel that this is unfair." These are not feelings. They are opinions disguised as emotions. A feeling is a personal, internal experience. Words like hurt, betrayed, fearful, frustrated, disappointed, or insecure. Identifying the true feeling requires you to move past the blame and look at what is happening inside you. Once you have identified your feelings, you must engage in the difficult work of expressing them without attribution. Expressing them without attribution means taking full responsibility for them. Instead of saying, "You made me feel ignored," which blames the other person for your internal state, try, "When you walked away while I was speaking, I felt ignored and I felt hurt." This keeps the focus on your experience, which is something you can speak to with authority, rather than making a claim about their character, which is something they are likely to contest. Crucially, you must also listen for the feelings of the other person. They are likely struggling with their own emotional suppression. As they speak, look for the emotional subtext beneath their factual arguments. If someone is being aggressively critical, they may be masking deep insecurity or a feeling of being undervalued. By creating a safe space for them to express their feelings, you often lower the defensive walls that have been preventing a resolution. Acknowledging and articulating your feelings is not a sign of defeat. It is the ultimate form of courage. It requires you to be honest with yourself about what is truly happening in your heart. By bringing these hidden emotions into the light, you change the nature of the conversation. You move from a sterile debate over facts to a human exchange that acknowledges the reality of the people involved. Only when both parties feel safe enough to bring their true selves to the table, feelings and all, can a genuine, lasting understanding begin to emerge. Chapter 6. Ground your identity. Ask yourself, what's at stake? Even if we master the art of untangling our stories, acknowledging our contributions and articulating our feelings, we often find ourselves still feeling paralyzed during a difficult conversation. We stutter, we lose our train of thought, or we suddenly capitulate to the other person's demands despite knowing better. When we reflect on why this happens, we realize it wasn't the other person's logic that defeated us. It was the quiet internal crisis that flared up during the exchange. This is the third conversation. The identity conversation. The identity conversation is the private, silent negotiation we conduct with ourselves regarding our own worth. It is the question of what this situation means for us and what it implies about who we are. Every difficult conversation holds the potential to threaten our sense of self. When we are criticized, or when we must deliver bad news, our minds immediately spiral. Am I a good person? Am I a competent professional? Am I capable of being loved? When these foundational questions are triggered, our equilibrium shatters. If we believe we must be all good to be worthy, we will struggle to acknowledge any part of ourselves that is angry, selfish, or wrong. If we believe we must be all competent, we will experience any mistake or feedback as a catastrophic failure of our identity. This is why we become defensive. We are not just protecting our point of view, we are desperately attempting to protect our internal image of ourselves from a perceived collapse. To manage this, we must first learn to identify our specific identity vulnerabilities. Most of us have a few core themes that are particularly sensitive. Perhaps you feel most vulnerable when your intelligence is questioned, or when you are accused of being insensitive to others. When you can name these triggers, they lose some of their power. You can catch yourself in the moment, acknowledging that your heightened anxiety is not because the situation is objectively disastrous, but because a personal sensitivity has been poked. The second step is to adopt an identity-neutral stance. We often operate with an all-or-nothing mentality. I am either a good person or a bad person. I am either a genius or a failure. This binary view is the primary fuel for our anxiety. We must learn to replace it with a more nuanced both-and perspective. You can be a dedicated, hard-working employee who nonetheless made a significant mistake on a project. You can be a deeply loving partner who occasionally acts in a way that is selfish or hurtful. Accepting that you are complex, multifaceted, and capable of both mistakes and triumphs allows you to stand on much firmer ground. Grounding your identity is about accepting that you are a work in progress. When you release the impossible demand for perfection, the need to be entirely beyond reproach, you become far more resilient. You no longer need to defend your identity because you have already acknowledged your human limitations. Furthermore, grounding your identity changes how you view the other person's feedback. Instead of hearing their critique as a final, damning judgment of who you are, you can hear it as valuable information. You can detach your sense of self from their assessment, allowing you to sift through their feedback for what is useful while discarding the rest. Ultimately, this is the most effective way to lower your internal volume during a high-stakes interaction. By acknowledging that your identity is not fragile and that it is not defined by a single conversation or a single outcome, you can face the challenge with clarity. You are no longer fighting for your existence, you are simply navigating a problem. When your identity is secure, you are finally free to listen, to learn, and to speak with authentic power. Chapter 7. What's your purpose? When to raise it, and when to let go. Before you initiate a difficult conversation, you must pause and ask a fundamental question. What is my purpose? We often rush into discussions armed with the assumption that we must solve the problem or win the argument. However, purpose is the compass that guides the entire interaction. Without a clear, constructive purpose, we are prone to impulsive reactions, shifting goals, and destructive outcomes. To define a productive purpose, you must identify what you truly hope to achieve. Are you seeking to understand the other person's perspective, to share your own reality, or to collaboratively solve a problem? A helpful technique is to ask yourself, what would a successful outcome look like? If your answer is to force them to admit they were wrong, you are likely heading for a disaster. If your answer is to create a space where we can both express our concerns and work toward a sustainable agreement, you are on the right path. Crucially, you must also determine whether a conversation is even necessary. We often feel compelled to clear the air or speak our truth immediately, but sometimes raising an issue can be counterproductive or even damaging to the relationship. You must assess the potential impact of the conversation. Is the issue significant enough to warrant the strain? Will the conversation likely lead to a deeper understanding, or will it simply stir up unnecessary resentment? There are 3 primary reasons to raise a conversation: to gain clarity and understanding, to voice your own experience, or to solve a problem. If your primary goal is to vent your anger or to punish the other person, you should wait. Venting rarely leads to resolution. It only deepens the divide. When you hold a conversation with the sole aim of correcting someone, you are essentially launching an attack. Conversely, there are moments when you must decide to let go. Deciding not to have a conversation is not the same as avoiding it. Avoidance is a fear-based passive reaction. Choosing to let go is an active, conscious decision based on the realization that the issue is not central to the health of the relationship or that the timing is not right for a productive exchange. You might choose to let go of minor irritations that you know are merely a byproduct of your own current stress. Or you might realize that the other person is currently not in a state where they can listen or engage constructively. Choosing to let go requires wisdom and patience. It is the ability to distinguish between what truly matters and what is merely a fleeting annoyance. When you do choose to engage, your purpose must be aligned with the learning stance. You are not there to dictate. You are there to collaborate. Your goal is to move from a place of conflict to a place of mutual understanding. By clarifying your purpose beforehand, you gain the composure and direction needed to navigate the conversation with integrity and resolve. Chapter 8. Getting Started. Begin from the 3rd story. The most critical moment of any difficult conversation is the opening, yet we almost always start in the wrong place. We typically begin by stating our own version of the story, our own conclusions and our own judgments. Whether we say, "I want to talk about how you've been ignoring my feedback," or "We need to discuss your lack of professionalism," we are effectively planting a flag in the ground and daring the other person to challenge it. We are starting from the first story, which is our own biased, defensive, and judgmental perspective. When you open with the first story, you trigger an immediate, predictable reaction. The other person begins to formulate their own version, the second story, in their head. They stop listening to you and start preparing their defense. The conversation is then trapped in an unproductive clash of opposing viewpoints before you have even managed to introduce the topic. To break this pattern, you must shift to the third story. The third story is the perspective of a disinterested, empathetic observer, a mediator who can see both sides without taking a position. It is a narrative that describes the gap between your story and the other person's story. It acknowledges that there is a disagreement, without framing either side as right or wrong. For example, instead of accusing a coworker of being lazy, the third story would sound like this: "I'd like to talk about our different views on how to manage the current project's workload. I have some concerns about how we are splitting the tasks, and I'm sure you have your own thoughts about how we've been working together. I'd like to understand your perspective so we can find a better way forward." Notice how the third story works. It is non-judgmental. It describes the issue, different views on workload, rather than the person, "You are lazy." Inclusive, it recognizes that both people have a perspective. "I have concerns, and I'm sure you have your own thoughts." Purposeful, it states the goal clearly. Find a better way forward. By starting from the third story, you invite the other person to be a partner in the conversation rather than an adversary. You remove the threat to their identity because you aren't attacking their character. You are simply acknowledging a difference in perception. You effectively lower the defensive walls and signal that you are not there to win, but to understand. This approach requires significant preparation. Before you open your mouth, you must mentally step outside of your own emotional intensity and ask, if a neutral mediator were watching this, how would they describe the conflict without taking sides? When you can articulate that perspective, you have the key to a productive opening. You aren't being nice by starting here, you are being strategic. You are creating the conditions necessary for the other person to actually listen to you. Chapter 9. Learning. Listen from the inside out. The most common mistake we make in difficult conversations is believing that listening is a passive activity, that it simply means waiting for our turn to speak. In reality, deep listening is the most demanding and active work you can do. It requires more than just hearing the words. It requires a disciplined, ongoing effort to understand the person across from you from the inside out. We often listen with an agenda. We listen to find the holes in their argument, to prepare our rebuttal, or to steer them toward our own conclusions. This is not listening. This is preparing for battle. When you listen to refute, you signal to the other person that their experience is something to be conquered, not understood. As a result, they inevitably become more defensive, and the cycle of frustration accelerates. To transform your listening, you must adopt a stance of genuine curiosity. This means letting go of the need to be right and replacing it with an authentic desire to see the world through the other person's eyes. It involves 3 core techniques. First, inquiry. Ask open-ended questions that invite the other person to elaborate. Instead of, "Did you mean to hurt me?" ask, "What were you hoping to achieve when you said that?" Or, "How did you see the situation unfolding?" Your questions should be motivated by a desire to fill the gaps in your own understanding, not to trap them in a corner. Second, paraphrasing. This is the art of repeating back what you have heard in your own words. It is not just mimicry. It is a way to test your understanding. By saying, "It sounds like what you are most frustrated about is that you feel unsupported in your role. Is that right?" You accomplish 2 things. You show the other person that you are truly paying attention, and you give them the opportunity to clarify or correct your understanding. This also forces you to slow down and process what they are actually saying, rather than just reacting to your own emotional internal narrative. Third, acknowledgement. This is perhaps the most underrated aspect of communication. Acknowledgement is not the same as agreement. You can acknowledge the intensity of someone's anger or the validity of their disappointment without agreeing that they are right or that their actions were justified. Acknowledgement is simply a recognition of their reality. by saying, "I can see how much this has upset you," or "I understand why that would be so frustrating for you." You communicate that they are heard. This validation is often all a person needs to lower their defenses and move into a more constructive, collaborative space. Deep listening is also an act of listening from the inside out. It means paying attention not only to the facts they are stating, but also to the emotions they are suppressing and the identity threats they are experiencing. Listen for the underlying stories they are telling themselves. Ask yourself, what are they afraid of here? What are they trying to protect? When you listen in this way, you change the nature of the conversation entirely. You become a partner in helping them articulate their reality. Even if you remain in profound disagreement about the facts, the act of being deeply heard creates a connection that is often the most important outcome of the entire process. When the other person feels that their perspective has been truly understood, they become significantly more capable of hearing yours. Chapter 10. Expression. Speak for yourself with clarity and power. Once you have established a learning stance and begun to truly listen, the time comes for you to speak. Many of us find this phase the most intimidating. We fear that expressing our truth will be seen as aggressive or that it will jeopardize the relationship. We often fall into the trap of either being too hesitant, softening our points until they lose all meaning, or too forceful, inadvertently attacking the other person under the guise of being honest. To speak with clarity and power, you must move beyond the binary of silence versus attack. The goal is to be assertive, in the best sense of the word, to speak your truth with directness while remaining fully committed to the learning stance. This requires you to share your story, your perspective, your feelings, and your needs without casting it as an objective, undeniable fact. When you express yourself, follow these core principles. First, take the lead in sharing your story. Do not wait for the other person to draw your perspective out of you. You are responsible for your own clarity. Start with your own conclusions, but immediately frame them as your own perspective, not an universal truth. Use phrases like, "the way I see it," or "my understanding of the situation is." This invites the other person to see your point of view while acknowledging that it is a subjective interpretation. Second, be direct and specific. Avoid generalizations or "you always, you never" statements. These are guaranteed to trigger defensiveness. Instead, describe specific behaviors and the impact they had on you. Do not say, "you are so unreliable." Say, "When the report was not submitted by the Friday deadline, I had to explain the delay to the client, which made me feel unprofessional and left me worried about our credibility." By rooting your concerns in specific observations, you provide the other person with something tangible to respond to, rather than forcing them to defend their character against an abstract charge. Third, express your feelings with responsibility. As we discussed previously, this means sharing your emotional state without attributing it to the other person's malice. Instead of saying, "you made me angry," say, "I felt angry when you made that comment, and I want to understand why we see this differently." By owning your feelings, you make it possible for the other person to respond to your emotions without feeling like they're being put on trial for them. Finally, invite them to respond. Your goal is not to have the final word. It is to keep the conversation moving toward a shared understanding. After you have clearly and courageously stated your story, ask for their perspective. "That is how it looks from where I am standing. I'd really like to hear how you see it and what you make of what I've just shared." Speaking with power does not mean you have to be loud or intimidating. True power in a difficult conversation comes from the ability to be vulnerable, honest, and clear, even while your own identity is feeling threatened. It comes from the courage to stand behind your own story while simultaneously holding the door wide open for the other person to step in and share theirs. When you speak in this way, you model the very behavior you hope to see in them, creating the space where a truly honest exchange can occur. Chapter 11. Problem solving. Take the lead. Once you have successfully shifted the dynamic from a battle of stories to a genuine learning conversation, where you have understood their perspective and they have heard yours, you arrive at the final phase, collaborative problem solving. This is where you move from understanding to action. The greatest hurdle at this stage is the temptation to jump to a solution too quickly, often before both parties fully understand the nature of the problem. When we are uncomfortable with the tension of a difficult conversation, we are eager to fix it and move on. However, premature problem-solving is often just another form of avoidance. If you propose a solution before you have explored the underlying causes, you are likely to propose something that doesn't actually address the root of the conflict, leading to further frustration later. To effectively lead the problem-solving phase, follow these essential steps. First, invent options together. Do not present your solution as a fait accompli. Instead, treat the problem as a shared puzzle. Ask, given what we both understand about the situation now, what are some ways we could approach this so that it works for both of us? This inclusive phrasing invites the other person to contribute their ideas, which significantly increases their buy-in and commitment to the final plan. When people help craft the solution, they are far more likely to honor it. Second, consider mutually beneficial standards. When your interests collide, do not rely on your relative power to decide the outcome. Instead, look for objective criteria or standards that could guide a fair resolution. Are there industry benchmarks, previous agreements, or shared principles we can point to? Using external standards helps remove the personal element from the negotiation, making it feel less like one person winning and the other losing, and more like a decision based on fairness and logic. Third, ask what if. Explore different scenarios. What if we tried this approach for a month and then checked back in? What if we adjusted our roles this way? Testing ideas in a low-stakes, temporary way lowers the pressure. It acknowledges that you might not get it perfectly right on the first attempt, and that the solution is an evolving process that can be refined as you learn more. Fourth, be transparent about your own needs. While you are focusing on a collaborative solution, do not lose sight of your own boundaries. You can be fully committed to a win-win outcome while still being clear about what you need to feel satisfied and secure. If a proposed solution requires you to sacrifice something that is critical to your core needs, say so. Transparency is the only way to ensure that the solution you reach is actually sustainable. Finally, document the agreement. It sounds overly formal, but for significant ongoing conflicts, clarifying who will do what and by when is crucial. Misunderstandings about expectations are a major source of future conflict. A brief, shared understanding of the path forward prevents the he said, she said dynamic from resurfacing. By taking the lead in this way, you are not acting as an authority figure, but as a facilitator of a constructive process. You are guiding the conversation from the abstract realm of grievances into the concrete realm of action, ensuring that the time and energy you have invested in the conversation translate into real, lasting change. Chapter 12. Putting it all together. We have explored the architecture of difficult conversations, the three layers of the what happened story, the feelings that reside beneath the surface, and the identity threats that keep us paralyzed. We have looked at how to shift from a posture of judgment to one of curiosity, how to disentangle intent from impact, how to map the system of contribution, and how to speak with clarity and power. But how does this look when you are actually in the middle of a high-pressure situation? Putting it all together is not about memorizing a script. It is about integrating these principles into your natural way of interacting. You will not always get it right. You will still feel defensive. You will still fall into the trap of blaming. You will still occasionally lose your composure. That is not failure. That is being human. The goal is not to be a perfect communicator, but to be a conscious one. The true essence of the learning stance is the willingness to remain curious even when you are frustrated, hurt, or frightened. It is the ability to hit the pause button when a conversation begins to spiral, to acknowledge your own emotional state, and to ask, what is happening here? What am I assuming? What am I missing? As you move forward, keep 3 final thoughts in mind. First, be patient with yourself. Transitioning to a learning stance is a profound psychological shift. It takes time to rewrite your own internal habits. You will find that you often realize you have fallen into a blame trap hours or even days after the conversation has ended. That realization is a victory. It means you are now paying attention to your own contribution, which is the necessary first step toward doing it differently the next time. Second, be patient with others. The person you are speaking with likely has no idea about the 3 conversations. They are operating under the same old assumptions that you are trying to unlearn. They may continue to attack, blame, and defend. Your task is to remain the anchor. By staying in the learning stance, you change the ecosystem of the conversation. You don't need them to understand these principles for you to apply them. Your consistent commitment to understanding will eventually shift the way they relate to you. Third, focus on the long game. A difficult conversation is rarely the final chapter. It is part of a larger, ongoing relationship. If you don't reach a perfect resolution in one sitting, that is okay. The goal is to move the relationship one step closer to honesty, clarity, and mutual respect. Ultimately, navigating difficult conversations is an act of courage. It is the decision to stop avoiding the things that matter most, and instead, to face them with integrity. It is the decision to prioritize the truth of the relationship over the protection of your own ego. By embracing this path, you not only improve your interactions with others, but you also deepen your own self-awareness and capacity for human connection. Every conversation is an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to build a bridge across the divides that keep us apart.